everyone, and welcome to the latest video in a series where I'm showing you step by step how I create planner, journal, and notebook modules either for print or digital use in Affinity Publisher for iPad. In the first few videos in the series, intended for beginners to the app, I'm doing a complete walkthrough of the user interface. In previous videos, we looked at the live dock screen and how to set up a new canvas. And in this video, we'll take a tour of the main interface in Publisher for iPad, where I'll walk you through the tools and studios. We'll also look at some of the secondary tools in the interface, like the contextual menu, command controller, and quick menu. Now, I do want to note this series is specific to the iPad version of the app. For those of you on the desktop, there's lots more coming for you, so stay tuned. Let's get started. If you're familiar with either Designer or Photo for iPad, then you're going to recognize the setup of the interface for Publisher for iPad. The main interface is broken down into 4 sections: the document view, tools, studios, and the contextual toolbar, which changes based on what tool is selected. The default setting for the interface is for right-handed people, but you can switch this to left-handed mode in the user interface category and settings. This is going to flip your tools and studios opposite of one another, but the contextual toolbar at the top will remain the same. I do want to note mine is flipped for a left-handed person. If yours isn't, our tools and studios are just opposite of one another. We'll be using many of these tools and studios in great detail as we run through the series, so I'm not going to spend too much focus on the ins and outs of how they work here in this video, but I do want to do a quick run through so you have an idea of the layout of the interface going into the rest of the series. The various tools for editing can all be found together on the one side and either work independently or in some cases in conjunction with the studios on the other side. Let's start at the top with this arrow. This is the Move tool. It allows you to select, move, rotate, and resize an object. You can use finger modifiers or this command controller at the bottom, which we'll look at in greater detail later in the video, as well as shortcuts on a Bluetooth keyboard to constrain the proportions of an object you're resizing or hold its rotation at a certain degree. For example, if I start to rotate this square and hold my finger down on the canvas, you can see it's rotating at 15-degree angles. If I resize it doing the same thing, it's going to scale proportionately. Just under the Move tool, the Node tool will allow me to edit the nodes of lines and curves. So I can adjust the paths in between here. I can change the nodes. I can use these handles to make any changes I like, just like in Designer with vectors. I can toggle between the Move and the Node tools either by selecting them manually or by double tapping on the shape. So you can see that it's switching between the two as I double tap. There are 2 text tools, the Frame Text tool and the Artistic Text tool. Frame Text adds a frame that acts as a placeholder for paragraphs, which I can style ahead of time. So I can change the font, the size, the color, and anything I add is going to be added in whatever I set up. Where the Artistic Text tool is best suited for adding decorative text on the spot as a one-off. So I can place it and then I can style it. I tend to use frame text more than artistic text when it comes to creating planners, especially when I know I'm going to be working on the desktop with whatever I'm creating here, because it allows me to create placeholders for any data merges I might perform. If I use it on the iPad, I do it in conjunction with text styles, which we're going to talk about in greater detail in another video, or to create placeholders, again, knowing that I'm moving into desktop for the data merges. The table tool is one we'll be using a great deal throughout this series to create everything from monthly calendar grids to digital papers. As you'd expect, it allows you to quickly create tables that can be further formatted using the Table Studio that we'll look at in a bit. As we're going to be using this a great deal through the series, there's much more to come on this one. The Pen tool will allow you to create custom shapes using nodes. And again, the Node tool that we already touched on can assist in editing those lines and curves that you create. Despite being called the Rectangle tool, there are actually multiple built-in shapes under the Rectangle tool that you can add to your document. So you'll just tap and then tap again and you can get the entire list. Just like with the Move tool, you can use finger modifiers, the command controller, or shortcuts with a Bluetooth keyboard to create and scale these proportionately. We'll be using these throughout the series to make elements for our planners like digital stickers or the vintage book plates, so we'll cover them in much more detail in upcoming videos. There are 2 built-in frame shapes, a square and an ellipse, and these are image placeholders that allow you to pull in images either from the stock studio or from external sources. And once you've done that, there are tools in place that allow you to scale them up easily and move them around. Now, while these are the built-in frames, you can actually turn any shape that you create, including text, into a frame. I've already created a tutorial on this and I've linked it in the description below. The Place tool will allow you to pull in an image or multiple images, either from your files or the photo app on your iPad. I personally don't use this one as much because I find that unless you convert it to a picture frame, you have to manually scale and place whatever you pull in, and you can't swap images out. While you can use this tool to pull in textures and other images for your planners, in this series I'm going to show you a different way to approach it using the gradient tool. Vector crop allows you to create a non-destructive crop of an object or group of objects as well as images. It creates a mask that you can either adjust or remove as needed. While the name implies that it only works on vectors, it's actually a great tool to use to crop raster images. And I have a tutorial on how to use the vector crop tool to isolate PNG elements from a grouping of transparent PNGs. It's something I use a lot when I'm creating digital stickers or washi tape and want to use the scans that I've created. The gradient tool allows you to apply solid colors, gradients, and bitmaps to an object's fill or stroke. I personally use this instead of the frame tool to pull my textures and other images in, especially on the iPad. And the reason that I prefer this over the frame tool is that in addition to pulling from external sources and the stock studio, I can also pull from the assets panel where I have seamless patterns set up that I use for my covers. Now, while you can easily place assets in a frame on a desktop version of the app, on the iPad, you have to manually clip the image in. This may seem like a minor inconvenience, but it can be inefficient, especially when you're pulling in multiple images. If I go to my layers here and I select my rectangle and I have my gradient tool selected, I can go to my assets here and just select one of these to set as a fill. And I can test this out as well as scale this up and down and keep swapping it out to test out different fills. In addition to that, the frame tool doesn't create a tiled image the way the gradient tool does. You saw that as I scaled it up and down, you're not seeing any edges because these are seamless and it's creating a pattern. We'll talk about the gradient tool in a lot more detail throughout the series, but for now, let's move on to the next tool. The transparency tool allows you to add a transparent gradient to your objects, both vectors and images, and it works similar to the gradient tool in its use of handles, allowing you to create transparencies in either linear format, elliptical, radial, conical. And this can come in handy to create shading or highlights when you're leaning into realism with your designs. This last tool is actually a group of tools, and you can tell that by the caret at the bottom left. It's the same idea as when we were in the rectangle tool earlier. I can tap and tap again and get the full list, and this includes both the color and style picker. The color picker is going to allow me to sample a color from one object and automatically apply it to another. So if I select my pink ellipse here and I grab my color picker tool and tap the gray ellipse, it's automatically going to apply that gray color. The style picker allows you to sample select attributes from one object or text and apply it to another. So this can be its fill, stroke, layer opacity, effects, as well as text and object settings. It's a quick way to apply the settings from one object to another very quickly. So if I wanted to select my blue rectangle here and add the same stroke and fill as the pink one next to it, I can select my style picker tool, make sure that rectangle is selected, and just tap on the one next to it, and it's automatically applying the stroke and fill. If this had any effects on it or anything like that, it would apply those as well, as long as I told the style picker to select those. One more note about the tools: if you're using a Bluetooth keyboard, you can temporarily select a tool by holding down on its keystroke. Once you release, it's going to go back to the tool that you were previously using. So I'm back here with my pen tool. I'm going to go ahead and select it and just start tapping out a shape. And if I hold down A on the Bluetooth keyboard that's attached to my iPad, it'll automatically switch over to the node tool. And I can just start dragging nodes around and adjusting them. As soon as I release that, you can see it switches back to the pen tool and I can keep doing what I was doing. Keyboard shortcuts are set up for both tools and studios, as well as some effects on Publisher for iPad. If you have a Bluetooth keyboard attached to your iPad, it can be really handy when it comes to creating planners. You can find a complete list under shortcuts in the settings, which is accessible at the bottom of the live dock screen. Now, before we move on to the other side and take a look at the studios, let's take a look at the contextual toolbar along the top that works in conjunction with the tools that we just went through. Before we dive into the contextual toolbar, I do want to note that if you're on a smaller iPad, you might need to scroll left or right to see all of the options along the top. If you're on a 12.9-inch iPad or larger, you shouldn't need to scroll unless you have display zoom set to larger text in your iPad settings. At the very left side, you'll see this arrow with 9 boxes, and that's going to take you back to your home screen so that you can save your documents, rename, and organize them. The second icon is the persona menu, and this is how you access Studio Link. Via Studio Link, you can access the primary vector tools in Designer and the primary raster tools in Photo, as long as you have one or both of the apps of the same version on your iPad. If you don't currently have the other two apps, you can certainly create a great deal just within the bounds of Publisher because it does have some basic vector and raster tools. However, Studio Link allows you to access tools that are unique to the other two apps and will allow you even greater customization of your layouts. I personally use Studio Link to jump between Publisher and Designer so that I can use symbols, the corner and contour tool, which are only available in Designer. I use Studio Link to jump between Publisher and Photo when I want to use filters that are only available in the latter. To jump between personas, just tap the icon once and choose the persona from the drop down menu. Follow the same process and then select Publisher to get back to where you were. Just a quick note though, Studio Link does not jump between the iPad and the desktop, though Studio Link is available between the three apps on the desktop version. That said, anything you create here on the iPad is going to be saved as an AF Publisher file, and that's the same format as the desktop. So you can easily save your work here and then open the document on the desktop when needed. I find this very handy because when it comes to creating planners on the iPad, I personally use it mostly to create the modules and then I pull it into the desktop to use data merge, which isn't available on the iPad. The hamburger icon next to the persona menu is the documents menu. From here, you can access functions such as export, packaging, printing, as well as document setup dialog so that you can make changes on the fly to the document layout that you set up in the new document dialog box. This is also where you'll be able to turn the command controller on and off. You can see that dot down at the bottom right going on and off. And we'll talk more about the command controller in a bit. The ellipsis next to the Documents menu is the Edit menu. This is where you can access functions such as duplicate, cut, copy, and paste. You can convert your vector shapes to curves or expand strokes. You can also access the conversion functions to create text and picture frames out of shapes as well as text paths. Now, many of these functions are also located in the Quick menu, which we'll look at in a bit. Everything beyond this line after the Edit menu is contextual in nature, which means it's going to shift depending on the tool that you have selected. For example, I currently have the Move tool selected, so if I tap this arrow, I get all of the basic settings that go along with the Move tool. I can also turn Auto Select on and off. I can change the order of my layers. I can flip my objects horizontally or vertically. I can adjust my alignment settings, and I can use basic geometric functions. Additionally, I can also use select same and object functions when the move tool is engaged. As soon as I change to a different tool, it's going to change that contextual menu. Now, I'm not going to go into every contextual menu in this particular video, but we're going to be accessing many of them throughout the series, so we'll touch on them there. At the right side of the contextual menu, there are three more static icons that do not change regardless of the tool selected. Each of these icons is made up of two parts. The left side is going to engage the tool, and the right side is going to provide you its menu options. This very first icon pulls up zoom options. Here you can jump to particular pages or the last page viewed, or you can change your zoom level. The second icon allows you to toggle preview menu on and off. And this is where you can turn on or off and adjust the settings of design aids like margins, grids, guides, and more. Tapping on the icon allows you to turn on any guides, margins that you already have in place, and then the menu options along the right side are going to allow you to access their settings. This last icon is snapping. Tapping on the left side is going to quickly turn snapping on and off, which means that you can snap objects to one another when you have this engaged. Accessing the list on the right side is going to allow you to change the snapping settings, such as tolerance and the list of snapping candidates. If you're already familiar with snapping from Affinity Designer, it works exactly the same way. Moving to the side again, let's look at the studio panels. Now, I will note mine will look slightly different from yours depending on the iPad you're using. The icons on this side are all scrollable on all iPads except for 12.9-inch Pro and larger. If you're on a larger iPad like mine, you're going to see these ellipses for the rest of the options instead of scrolling. Starting from the top is the Color Studio, and this is where you can select the color of your fill and stroke for your shapes, text, and curves, choosing either from sliders or color wheel. You can swap the fill and stroke of your objects very quickly by selecting the object and just swiping back and forth on this filled circle and this donut shape at the very top. You can quickly turn off either by selecting them and swiping up, or selecting and using the null icon down here in quick colors. Additionally, you can change the luminance value of either very quickly by selecting it and scrolling your Apple Pencil up and down on the icon on the side. Additionally, you can change the opacity of your fill and stroke as well as the noise level. You'll also find quick and recent colors at the bottom, and if you click this right facing caret here, it's going to take you to swatches, which is a set of color palettes. There's a lot of built-in swatch palettes, but you can also create or import your own. Next up is the Stroke Studio, and this is where you can set the width and other properties of your lines and curves. So I can change things like the width, I can change the cap, I can set the pressure settings here. This is the main Stroke Studio where you can change the stroke settings on shapes, text, and anything you create outside of the table tool. Throughout this series, as we begin using the table tool to create some of our calendar pages, you're going to see another similar stroke studio, and that's specific to the strokes on the tables that we create. Now, one more note about this, just like the color studio, if you want to change the width of your selected stroke on the fly, you can run your finger or your Apple Pencil up and down on the icon for the stroke studio here. It doesn't work as quickly as the color studio, but you can see that as I run this up and down, my width is changing. Next up is the layer panel, and this is where you can keep track of your layers. You can rename, you can reorder them, you can group them up. You can also set their opacity and blend modes, as well as make other changes via the layer options here under the ellipses. You can select layers by tapping on them individually, or if you want to select more than one, you can select the first one and then either swipe left. Or if you're selecting contiguous layers, the easiest way to do it is select the first one and then two finger tap to select the final one in order. You can also swipe right and get additional options for your layers. Next, we come to the Pages panel, and this is where the pages as well as the master pages are housed. We're going to spend a great deal of time in this panel throughout the course of the series, and as I mentioned in a previous video, master pages allow you to create set layouts that can be applied to multiple pages or spreads all at once, and the pages are the individual content pages that can be tied to those masters and are ultimately what gets exported. You can cycle between the two by using the carets or the drop down here. And if you want to select an individual page or master, you can simply double tap on it and it's going to take you right to it. I highly recommend doing that before you start working in a page because sometimes if you're just scrolling, if you don't scroll all the way, Publisher doesn't register that's the one you're on. So I just recommend taking that extra step of just double tapping and making sure that you're working in the right page. There are other options within this panel that can be accessed either via the dots at the top here or the menu options at the bottom. You can also hold your finger down on either a master page or a regular page for additional options. Again, we're going to be using master and content pages a great deal throughout the series, and I'll go into a greater detail on both when we do. The Text Studio works in conjunction with both the artistic and frame text tools as well as the table tool. It's going to allow you to format your text, whether it's directly to the characters or paragraphs themselves or using text styles, which we're going to use in this series to set up consistent typography for our planners. The FX Studio allows you to add non-destructive effects to shapes and text. So I can select this shape and let's say I want to make it 3D. I can go ahead and turn on the 3D effect and then tap to get the contextual menu over here on the side and then make any changes that I want to. Again, these are all non-destructive effects, so you can always go back in and make changes to them. We're going to be using these to add drop shadows as well as some 3D and bevel and emboss effects to add a touch of realism to our planners. The Assets panel is a great way of storing elements that you've created that you may use often and want to be able to access from any document. And it doesn't necessarily have to be something that you created here in Publisher, because asset categories can be linked between designer, publisher, and photo on the same machine by going up to the top here and choosing link category. Now you can see mine's grayed out. So that means it's already linked, which means anything that I create, say in designer and place in this pattern hub category is automatically going to come up here in publisher. When it comes to creating digital planners and journals, I have a few asset categories that I set up and I use often. The first one is this pattern hub, and I showed you this earlier when we were talking about the gradient tool. I use this to quickly apply my seamless designs to the covers of my planners. I also use it for digital stickers. I have one set up for text style combinations that I've created. Text styles don't carry over from canvas to canvas. So, what I've done is create combinations that I pull into the canvas I'm in, and it automatically sets them up in that canvas. I've created an entire tutorial on how to do this, and I've linked it in the description below. And then finally, I have a planner hub that's set up as well. And I have one set up here in one on my desktop. This allows me to pull in any elements that I created, things like binder rings or say this snap. And anything that I've created and then saved to my assets is exactly as I created them, including any effects, textiles, etc. So I can pull them in, make any adjustments that I need to, and I have a brand new element that I can use without having to start from scratch. So it's a really efficient way to work. The Stock Studio gives you in app access to both Pexels and Pixabay, where you can pull in free use images for your designs. And we're going to be using this a lot throughout the series to add texture to our planners. The Resource Manager provides a list of all images and documents that are in your Canvas, whether they're linked or embedded. So, this is where you can see items that are placed, as well as details about them, such as their dimension and placement type. This is also where you can relink resources that may have come untethered from their external folder when you're using linked placement. The Preflight panel will give you either the all clear or warnings about your designs, allowing you to double check that there's nothing that needs to be fixed before export. An example of this when it comes to planners is if you have a hyperlink in place that doesn't have an anchor, it's going to give you a red flag that you need to fix it in order for it to work properly. I'm going to move into the ellipses here. This first option is adjustments, and this is going to allow you to apply non-destructive image adjustments like curves, levels, or a black and white adjustment that can be adjusted and removed at any time. Remember with Studio Link, I mentioned that you have access to the first tier of tools in Photo and Designer, but as I mentioned back in that section, you do have some basic vector and image tools in Publisher itself, and these are some of them. The text wrapping panel assists when wrapping text around images, frames, shapes, and other text. Now, we're not going to be using that in this series, but it's handy when creating spreads with a mix of text and images or multiple columns of text, such as magazine layouts. We're going to be using the table panel a great deal throughout the series. The table panel works in conjunction with the table tool. Any changes that you want to make to any tables that you create, from their stroke and fill colors to their cell sizes, are all going to be made here in this panel. And this is where you're going to find a table specific stroke panel that is not the same as the one up at the top. The anchor panel is where you're going to create and edit the anchors that are ultimately tied to the hyperlinks panel, which is right below it. We're not going to be focusing on the remaining panels in this list, but I'm going to run through them quickly. The cross references panel is where you can insert cross references from one page in your document to another. The fields panel is going to allow you to insert pieces of information within your document that's automatically updated, so something like page numbers. Now, I do use this panel when I'm creating a planner on the desktop version because it's an integral part of the data merge process. However, here on the iPad where that doesn't exist, I don't find the need to use it because I don't tend to add page numbers to my planners. The table of contents and index pages allow you to insert a table of contents and indexes within your document to help your readers locate important topics or pages. And the notes panel allows you to insert footnotes, side notes, and endnotes. Pinning is going to allow you to pin shapes, images, tables, or text frames to main text so that as you add more content, those stay with the main text. And then the font manager is going to help you keep tracks of the fonts used within your document and quickly make substitutions if it's necessary. Now, this can actually come in handy if you work between the iPad and the desktop and don't have a font loaded on one or the other. It's going to give you a heads up that the font's not available on that machine and automatically substitute something, but you can go ahead and add the font. And then finally, the tags panel is going to allow you to add assistive information to your document like alt text. So when it's exported to a PDF, the reader's able to use assistive technology. Moving down to the very bottom, let's look at the transform panel. This is where you can reorder, rotate, resize, and you can move your objects with more precision than using the move tool itself. Additionally, you have align and distribute options here that are more than the ones you have up here in the contextual menu. The navigator will allow you to zoom into your canvas at specific percentages. You can use the numbers here. You can also swipe up and down on the icon for the navigator to zoom in and out from the center of the canvas. Once you're zoomed in, you can tap within the navigator to go to a particular point. You can double tap in the window to bring it back to fit to screen. You can also rotate your canvas here, or you can lock rotation if you prefer not to allow yourself to do that with gestures. The history panel is going to track changes up to a number that you set up in the settings for the app under general and undo limit. It's basically taking a snapshot that allows you to move back to a key time in the history of your document so that you can undo everything that came after that. I prefer to keep my undo limit to somewhere between 110 and 120 because the higher the number, the more events are saved and you can run into lag with your iPad. I personally haven't found the need to go over 120. In fact, even that might be too high. And then finally, you'll see a question mark at the bottom. If you ever can't find an icon, simply tap and hold on that question mark, and all of these labels are going to come up. One more thing I want to mention that I didn't mention when we were on the tool side is this X here. You'll see an X and you're going to see a trash can. X is going to allow you to deselect, and of course, the trash can is going to delete the object that you have selected. All right, let's wrap up the tour of the interface with the quick menu and the command controller. The quick menu can be accessed a few different ways. You can three-finger swipe down on the canvas. You can long press on the canvas, which I find a little easier than the three-finger swipe, which can sometimes move the canvas, or you can double tap in the center of the command controller. You can also set your Apple Pencil in the app settings to double tap to open and close the quick menu. The quick menu works in similar fashion to the contextual toolbar in that its lower contents depend on the tool you have engaged, the persona you're in, and what, if anything, you have selected. The top bar is always going to remain the same. It's going to include duplicate, cut, copy, paste style, and delete, just like the edit menu at the top. The bottom menu comes with a set of defaults in a set order, but you can customize both the options and the layout of the 9 large buttons at the bottom. To change the label of a button, just long press on the button until this list appears. Now, this is a list of commands that are not currently assigned, so that those are already in place or already filtered out. Just select the command and it's going to swap it out. You can also choose to leave a button blank if you prefer by choosing one of these at the bottom. To change the order of the buttons, long press until things start to wiggle. Now, this isn't going to push things out of the way. You're literally going to swap buttons. So let's say that I want to swap this with the select all. I'm going to bring this over the top and it's going to swap just those buttons. I personally don't use this option that much. If you decide you want to reset back to factory settings, just long press one of the buttons, go down to the very bottom, and you can just reset. Now, I found that over time, there are particular commands that I use quite frequently, and rather than having to go up to the edit menu, I find it's far more efficient to have them right there in the quick menu. And finally, let's take a look at the command controller. In the absence of a Bluetooth keyboard, and rather than using finger modifiers, you can use the command controller to access the 4 most used modifier buttons: Shift, Command, Option, and Control. You can toggle the command controller on and off from the Documents menu up here at the top. And by default, it's going to be set for a right-handed person and appear on the left side of the screen. But if you're left-handed like me and you want to have it sit on the right, just long press until it starts to pulse like this and move it to wherever you want. As soon as you release your finger, it's going to be set in place. To wake the command controller, you can simply tap on it. Now, it's not going to stay awake long, so you're going to want to make your selection rather quickly. You have the option of either holding or locking the modifier in place. If you just want to hold it, simply start in the middle and drag to the modifier you wish to choose. And as long as your finger keeps the center button over that modifier, it's going to remain active until you release. You can also select multiple modifiers at the same time. So if I swipe up here diagonally, you can see I'm choosing Shift and Command at the same time. So if I wanted to scale an ellipse up and down and keep its aspect ratio locked, I can simply hover over the Shift modifier. If I want to lock the aspect ratio and scale from the center of the shape, I can just move between the two of them. Now you can also lock the modifier so that you don't have to hold your finger in place. There are two ways to do this. You can wake the command controller and select the one that you want to lock, and you can continue to do that if you want to select more than one. The other way to do that is to start in the middle and swipe up and past the modifier that you want to choose. And again, if you want to choose more than one, just keep doing that. Now, modifiers can either be unlocked by tapping on the icon, or when you move to a new tool, it's automatically going to release them. And that completes the tour of the user interface. If you have any questions about anything you learned in this video or the previous ones, let me know below. Next up in the series, we're going to take a closer look at how master pages work while we set up the background layout for our planners. Other lessons in the series are going to include creating realistic binder rings and vintage book plates, as well as how to efficiently make multiple types of digital papers using the table tool. If you have a particular planner topic that you'd like to see covered as part of this series, let me know below. And if I'm not already in the process of creating it, I'll look at adding it to the list. I have lots of other content coming up on my YouTube channel in all of the Affinity apps, so stay tuned. But in the meantime, you might want to check out one of these two next. Thanks for watching.